Hey everyone, welcome to today's episode of Period Story. Before we get into today's episode, I wanted to share some exciting news with you all. We've been nominated for Best Podcast in the Creative Impact Awards. If you'd like to vote for us, go to www.creativeimpact.group/awards. Thank you so much. Your vote means so much. Hi, I'm Lenice Brothers, a registered nutritionist, women's health, hormone, and menstrual cycle coach, and the founder of Eat, Love, Move, a nutrition and well-being practice. This is the Period Story podcast, where in each episode, I sit down with a guest to talk about their period story. We get behind some of the myths and misconceptions about periods and so much more. Now, on to today's guest. On today's episode, we have Lauren Lee Crane and Catherine Lee. They are the founders of Semaine, a health and wellness supplement for people with painful periods. They started Semaine after both being diagnosed with endometriosis and undergoing multiple surgeries. Lauren says that she doesn't want other women who have painful periods, endometriosis, adenomyosis, and PCOS to go through what she did. Catherine says that normalizing the conversation around periods and period pain is exactly why she wanted to start Semaine. They wanted to find a natural way to support women's health and voice their stories. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Lenice. We're so happy to be here.
Yes, thank you. So excited.
Can you both start off by telling me the story of your first period?
Yes, this is Catherine. I will tell my story first because I got my period first, which I did not. I was very upset because I thought as twins, we were supposed to do everything together. And I think I got my period almost like 6 to 12 months before Laura did. And I remember it very vividly. We grew up outside of Washington, D.C. and Maryland. And every summer, our extended family had a beach condo in Ocean City, Maryland, which is on the eastern seaboard. So we were at the beach, of course. We were at that condo, and I still remember there are 2 bathrooms in that condo, and the bathroom where I discovered I had my period, it had all these like orange and brown daisy wallpaper. And I so like that's like stuck in my. But anyways, so I was like, I saw it started my period, and I was like, oh no. And I remember I told my mom, and she was like so excited. At least that's the impression I got. Like maybe she was like, oh my gosh, what's going on? And I remember it was when this is going to age us for sure, but it was like a couple years after Frappuccinos came out in Starbucks. And there were no Starbucks in Ocean City at the time, but my mom had found like a recipe to make Frappuccinos at home. So I remember she like took out the blender at the beach condo and like made Frappuccinos, and we all like cheered to my womanhood. And I was mortified, and I was just like, I don't want this. And I think eventually, like within those first couple of months of having my period, I think I asked my mom for a hysterectomy. Like I didn't really know what it was. I just thought it was like it meant you didn't have to bleed every month. So my mom was like, but you're gonna want to have babies and all those things. And I was like, not worth it. Don't want this. Get it out of my body. I don't want it. Which is like not. And I remembered, like, you know, with reading like articles, like reading teen magazines and stuff and like, books, like or young girls were so excited to get their periods. And I was like, I can't relate. I don't want this at all. And I know, Laura, you could talk about it, but I know you were like equally mortified for me. Oh, Kath was 12. Yeah, so we were a little bit older, I feel like. And when Kath got her period, I remember I was just like, oh my God, thank God I don't have mine yet. And I think the reason why we felt that way is we were both dancers. We wanted to be ballerinas. I feel like most little girls at some point want that. We continued to want that until we were 18, and we danced all the time. We did like 25 hours of ballet every week. That was our life. And as a ballet dancer, anything that's going to cause you inconvenience or make it harder for you to be a ballet dancer, whether it's to develop breasts, you know, you just want to be skinny. You just want to be able to move the way that you're used to moving when you're 11 to 17. And I remember I was like, a period's going to be such an annoyance because, you know, you have to wear a tampon, you have to wear a pad. So I remember when Kat got her period and she was saying like she was so embarrassed. It was just me and my mom and my dad there. It's not like we had other people at the condo with us. And I was so embarrassed for her. I was like, oh my God, why are we talking about Catherine's period? I'm so glad I don't have mine. And Kath was right. I did get mine 6 months after her. And I actually had mine when we were doing the Nutcracker. So every December, every bunhead in the world does the Nutcracker at some point. And Kath and I were getting changed. This was, a couple hours before we went on stage. And I was putting my costume on. And I noticed there's like a little bit of blood on my tights. And I was like, oh no. I was like, I know what this is. No, why is it happening now? And of course, happening right before you're going on stage, you're already sort of like nervous and excited. And then getting this thing that Kath and I, obviously we never wanted. I know they're women you've had on your podcast and our friends who were excited to get their period. That was never our experience. And I think a big part of that was being ballet dancers and being so focused on wanting to do that, and the sort of strange culture that the ballet world is. I mean, it's not like our ballet dancer teachers ever said, oh, getting your period is bad. I just remember hearing older ballet dancers talking about it and how painful it could be, and how, like I remember the Sugar Plum Fairy one year having to ask the costumist just to keep taking her out of her tutu because she had to go put a new tampon in. And I remember I was like, oh my God, that sounds like such a headache. So that was our experience with periods and ballet.
To talk a bit about being bunheads. So for people who don't know what that expression means, typically it refers to girls who do is it ballet, and does it also include gymnasts as well, or is it only ballet?
I think I've only heard it used with ballet, and it's like, okay. And when you're doing ballet at a relatively high level, like a pre-professional level, like it wasn't until like probably we were 16 that we just assumed we weren't going to be going to university, that we would immediately go into a company, or if we were lucky enough, maybe we'd apply to Juilliard, which is a very well-known school. But if you did ballet specifically, not modern dance or something like that, you essentially go into a company as early as like 16, depending on where you are. And it wasn't until we were 16 or 17 that we realized, oh, maybe we should get a college degree.
Tell me a bit more about the ballet. Well, I did ballet when I was really little, but the only thing I really know about ballet is Christmas equals Nutcracker, and then the Black Swan, the movie. That's it.
That is totally understandable. I feel like that's most people's experience with ballet. And to be honest, Kath and I have never seen Black Swan because we're like, it's going to hit too close to home. So we've never watched it. But really, I feel like how it changed for us is when we were about 8 years old, we decided, this is our life. We started when we were about 3 because we had seen Baryshnikov, famous male ballet dancer, dancing on television, and I thought he was flying, and I was like, yes, that is what I want to do. So I think a lot of people assume it's like the pretty tutus or the point shoes, but for us, we saw Baryshnikov and we were like, that's it, that is life. And so we took like sort of the classes everybody takes when you start ballet, and there's like tap in it and jazz when we were younger. And when we were 8, we went into this pre-professional academy. And so we would go to ballet anywhere from, like, when we were younger, it was like 3 days a week. By the time we were in high school, or about the age of 13, 14, we were going, 5 to 7 days a week, and even leaving school early in order to go to class longer. And it's a very, very structured, very hierarchical, and very sort of rigid world. So each year you're trying to progress to sort of the next year. And within those years, you're also doing performances. So the Nutcracker is the big one in the winter, but we'd have multiple performances in the spring and the summer as well. And then in the summer, you'd also be applying for workshops with bigger companies like the Royal Ballet, if we were in the UK, or American Ballet Theatre. We would do workshops with the Joffrey Ballet Theatre. We were
often considered a little too exotic for the ballet world. We were told that multiple times. So we didn't have as much luck with some of the bigger companies because we didn't have the quote unquote look. This was in the 90s. Things have definitely changed now, not as much as they should, but Misty Copeland's out there, which is awesome.
Yeah.
But that was very different for us in sort of the late 90s. We were just told we wouldn't fit into the core very well. So this was happening when we were sort of in our later teenage years. And one of the reasons why we ended up getting out of ballet and going to university instead, just because of some of the discrimination we face. But and when you're in that world, it just seems like even though you see that discrimination, you see, the body dysmorphia that can happen. And obviously the way we thought about our periods was not particularly healthy. It was still such a dream for us, like that, still having such a passion for something that almost nothing else mattered, and you were just going to do whatever it took to get to where you wanted to be. And Kath and I were lucky to have each other because it's a very, very competitive atmosphere. The teachers are not particularly supportive. And we never competed against each other as twin sisters. It was like if Kat did well, I felt like I was doing well, even if she got a better part than me. But for the most part, it's not like a team sport. You are very much sort of alone in trying to be better than the next person next to you. So it's a very, it's sort of a strange way to grow up because that, we weren't focused. We always had to do well in school because our parents were like, if you don't do well in school, we're taking you out of ballet. So we got the straight A's or whatever we needed to do in order to stay with ballet. But really that wasn't important to us. It was just do as well as you can at ballet. Nothing else really matters. And that's, most people are going to parties when they're teenagers or doing things like that. And we didn't. It was just like ballet, ballet, ballet all the time.
And a big part of it too was like Laura was saying about the teachers, like a lot of it in that world is just like you're so desperate to get approval from all the teachers that you have because they're the ones who can help push you into a company. They're the ones that give you better roles in different ballets and stuff like that. And then along the same side, of course, and then you have the whole like body image aspect of it, which you always hear about with ballet. Lauren and I were very lucky. We never had to worry about weight problems. I think that's the Asian side of us. We were naturally skinny, so we were very lucky in that. But we also didn't have, like Laura said, we didn't have the looks. We weren't blonde and blue-eyed. And then on top of that, we didn't really have the body type either. We're tiny. We're like 5'3" on a good day. And our points, our feet weren't exactly like perfect. Our legs didn't come up to, our shoulders. We didn't have super long legs. I think our torso and legs are kind of even size. So it was all these things. It was funny because it was like, we were very lucky. We had friends that, suffered with anorexia and stuff, and we didn't have that. But for us, it was like, growing up knowing our bodies weren't quite right for that world. So and then on top of that, you get your period at 12 and 13, and so it's like one more thing to contend with. And the worst part was when like bloating started, because I don't think I started bloating. I don't know. I can't really remember. I was not in touch with my body at all at 12 and 13, but, you can't like suck in your stomach. And I remember dance teachers, you wouldn't tell them you were on your period, and they would constantly tell you if your stomach was sticking out, and you'd be like, this is not my stomach. This is my uterus.
Can you both talk about how you feel if you thinking back to what you went through and the comments that were made about your body, so the bloated belly, from what we know now is endometriosis, and the comments about you being quote unquote exotic. Talk about how you feel looking back on that now and whether that had any lasting effect on the way you view yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely does. We are now in our 30s, so it's been almost 20 years since we were in that very dysfunctional world. But for sure, I still remember the comments that the teachers made either when we were on our periods, and I remember the times when I had such painful periods, but you still had to dance. And I remember the idea was you just shoved down whatever pain your body was feeling, and you did what you had to do, and that is still the idea that stuck with me, I think, through my 20s for sure. So even when my endo pain was getting a lot more acute. It wasn't just super heavy, painful cramps anymore. I was getting sharp jabbing pains in my pelvis. I remember just thinking, okay, this is another pain I have to deal with. You just take some painkillers and you go to work. You just keep doing what you have to do. And, part of ballet is discomfort and pain, whether it's point shoes, your feet always hurt, or just how you're using your body is, it's like any athlete, you're also creating a lot of wear and tear on your body because of how demanding it is. But that sort of pain and rigor is it feels normal. It feels like part of what you have to deal with. And for me, painful periods, and because I feel like a lot of the women we were dancing with also had painful periods, and I don't think most of them had endo, but I don't know if it's like a body fat thing. You had really irregular periods because you didn't have a lot of body fat on you, and you were probably stressed out a lot. Your body was physically stressed a lot. So I remember just thinking periods were horrible and painful and abnormal and could be super heavy one month, and then you wouldn't get it the next month. And that just seemed like a normal thing to me. And we definitely never talked about that side of our bodies with our teachers. The teachers, it was all physical appearance, like superficial appearance, if you were looking a certain way. And I think, the other ways that they told us, being too exotic, being too short. And I remember they said our legs weren't straight enough. And that's always stuck with me because my legs are slightly bow-legged, which I don't think you would normally think about if you were a normal person who hadn't done ballet. But I remember one of our teachers being like, we could have fixed that if you had told me about this when you were younger. And now you'll always have bow legs and no company is going to take you. I remember thinking
Which is like, if you look at Lauren, she doesn't, it's not, I don't think you have bald legs. That's the thing. Like, it's like these little things that get stuck in your brain, For my thing, it was like, our arms didn't straighten all the way or in the right line and our legs didn't. But like, I didn't even know you had that bald legged thing. She also has like a very subtle scoliosis. And it was so subtle that teachers just thought she was not stretching her neck out enough, so she couldn't like turn her head. So it's this constant thing where it's like, it's on you, to fix things that are wrong with your body. The responsibility is on you. Obviously, we couldn't do anything about our ethnicity. That was, we never felt ashamed of the way we looked, but it was just accepting. There's a lot of stuff we accepted back then, I think, because we were kids and it was the 90s that nowadays I don't think they could have gotten away with. But like, just accepting like, well, yeah, we're not blonde and blue-eyed, so we're not going to get certain roles, since our bodies aren't exactly right, we're not going to be, the teachers aren't going to pay attention to us the same amount of way. And that was just that was, to us, that was part of the world. We just stayed focused in it.
You both have mentioned pain quite a lot, and something I find quite fascinating about ballet dancers is you mentioned the point shoes and how you just have to, it's painful and you're putting your foot in a really unnatural way and basically balancing on your tiptoes for like what 5-6+ hours, however long you're dancing that particular day. And do you think that having to go through that or deal with that pain on an ongoing basis kind of numbed you to the endometriosis pain in the beginning?
Yeah, absolutely. I just remember thinking that, as a dancer, your feet are sort of shaped a certain way and you have a lot of pain, but it's also something you learn to sort of pull out of a little bit. There's ways that make it a little less intense, but I think you're absolutely right using that word numbing, because it's kind of a weird contradiction, because as dancers, you are very self-aware about your body, just in the ways we were saying, because things are constantly pointed out to you, but also just moving your body and being able to move through space a certain way and control it a certain way. You're very aware of the way your muscles move and the way your center of gravity is. But at the same time, you do numb yourself out to any discomfort or any pain, because that isn't going to help you, perform. So it's this weird dichotomy of being very aware of your body, but at the same time, if there's pain or things that are hurting, that's something to ignore or push down, rather than say, I wonder why I have really painful periods. I wonder why my cramps are so intense, I didn't even ever question if that was normal. Our mom also had really, really intense periods. And I'm sure she had endometriosis. It was probably not at the same stage that maybe I had it. But that was another thing, in our household, it was sort of normalized that periods were painful. And my mom is also a very stoic person. Well, I wouldn't say I'm stoic. She is a stoic person. And so she never really complained. She would just say, oh, my period's really hurting right now, but I'm going to continue to cook food for our entire family during Christmas, or, clean the house. It's just part of what you have to deal with, is this pain.
Can you talk about both of your individual endometriosis journey? Because, so Lauren, you said you had painful periods from the age 15. And then Kath, you said that in your late 20s, you started to have worsening symptoms from endo. Can you talk? So you both had endometriosis, but very different experiences. So can you individually talk about what happened to you?
Yeah. So my endometriosis story is like a lot of women with endometriosis. It took a really long time to get diagnosed. I think the average time for women to get diagnosed is about 7 to 10 years. For me, it was about, 15 years. And the reason why is because I think culturally we normalize period pain in a lot of ways, not just in the ballet world or not just in our family. But I feel like whenever I went to a doctor and said, oh yeah, my periods are very painful, they'd be like, oh yeah, that's too bad. You should, you can go on birth control, or, just keep taking ibuprofen. Like that's all you can do. So even at the point when, being 15 years old and my periods were starting to get really painful, and it was mainly really, really, I could have really heavy periods, and then I'd have really, really intense cramping where you had to lay down. Like I just could not sit up straight, and my body was just like bent double. And that didn't happen every single period, but it happened, often enough. And I always dreaded getting my period. It was never something I was excited about or just thought, oh, hey, I'm bleeding now. I always knew when I had my period and it was painful. I don't remember skipping school or anything, because again, I thought you just keep doing what you need to do. So, this is something that's going to happen every month or every other month if it was erratic, and you just had to deal with it. And then, like Kath and I both had the experience where as we moved through our 20s, that pain sort of shifted from really heavy cramping. To me, it was a lot of sharp jabbing pain. Like I explain it as sort of, it feels like you have a bouquet of sharp knives sort of sitting up in your pelvis. That's how endo felt to me. And I was lucky in the sense that I've only ever had the pain during my period. I know a lot of women with endo, you have pain throughout your whole cycle. And I felt so lucky that it was just that week, but then you have a quarter of your month is something you absolutely dread. And at the time, my husband and I were moving abroad. We went to the UK to live in Edinburgh. And at that point, I was like, you know what? I'm pretty sure I have endometriosis. I Googled it. I talked to my doctor about it. And she was like, oh, yeah, I bet that's what you have. I mean, that was the conversation. That was it. And so, again, it was something where it's like, okay, I just need to deal with it and figure it out on my own. And so I tried changing my diet. I went vegan, gluten-free, dairy-free, all the things. And my pain just kept getting worse because I think at that point, I had so much scarring within my body. I also had an endometrioma, which I didn't know about, which is a specific type of cyst you can get with endometriosis, especially in the later stages. So endometriosis, for those of you that don't know, are staged similar to cancer. So you have stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I ended up having stage 4. I didn't know that at the time, and no one had told me about these different stages. But as I was experiencing worse and worse pain, I would go to my GP in Edinburgh and tell her, like, it's getting worse and I don't know what to do about it. And then at the point that it was about 6 months before my first emergency surgery, I remember feeling a lump on the left side of my body around where my left ovary would be. And of course, that freaked me out. I just assumed it was ovarian cancer. And I told my GP and she's like, it's not really anything to worry about. I don't think you have to worry. And I really had to push her to get me an appointment to see an ultrasound technician. And I finally got that like a couple months later. And the technician was like, oh, honey, I'm so sorry you have an endometrioma. And I was just so happy it wasn't cancer. I was like, I don't know what that is, but that sounds fine. And she was like, but you'll need surgery. And I was like, that's okay. I'm okay. Take it out. And I had no idea what it was. Like, I just was like, okay, it's not cancer. We'll schedule a surgery 6 months from now. Great. We'll get it done. And I don't know if it's just like experiencing pain. You're just like, oh, surgery. Yeah. Massive surgery doesn't sound like a big deal, because let's just do what we need to do. And before I could have that surgery, the endometrioma ruptured. Again, I didn't know that's what was happening at the time, but it felt like something had kind of broke or snapped in my body. And I just had so much pain flooding into my pelvis at that point. And I remember this was really early in the morning, and my husband had to call 999. And the EMTs came, and I was lying on the floor, and the guy was like, "You kind of look okay." Essentially, like, he took my vital signs or whatever, and he was like, "You look okay." And I was like, "I can't get up off the floor." And he was like, "Well, you probably have like a sore tummy." Like, it was a really odd experience. Like, I was like, "No, I literally, like, I'm in so much pain." And he started to like get ready to leave, and I was like, "I have a heart condition." I was like, because I have mitral valve prolapse, which is very common for a lot of women, and it's never something that bothered me. But I knew if I said I had a heart condition, they had to take me to the hospital. And so he was like, "Oh, okay." So then they took me to the hospital, and even though I told them I had endometrioma, I have endometriosis, they were like, "We think it's appendicitis." And I was like, okay. So it took them about 24 hours to decide what to do with me. And I finally ended up in the gynecological ward, and I think they thought I had an STD. Like, I was in so much pain, and they did an exam on me with like a speculum, and it hurt so much. And they still kind of didn't believe what was going on. And I started running a really high fever. And that happened over the course of a couple days. And then during those couple of days where they still couldn't figure out what was going on, my stomach swole up because of all the fluid that was pulling into my pelvic cavity. Basically, it was the endometrioma had ruptured and was like irritating everything. So my body was trying to protect all my organs. I looked about 6, 7 months pregnant. And that was when they were finally like, "Oh, okay, we need to do an ultrasound and see what's going on." So this was like day 5 of being in the hospital. And they were like, "Oh, okay, you have 500 milliliters of fluid. We need to go in and do emergency surgery and pull all of that out." And after the surgery was when they were like, "Yes, you have endometriosis. It was a ruptured endometrioma. This is what happened." And so I was in the hospital for 2 weeks, and that was after the EMT almost didn't take me to the hospital. So it's such a bizarre experience to by your GP, by everyone being told like, "Oh, it's not a big deal," and then this thing happens, this very traumatic, big experience happens. And so that's been it's been a hard journey. And since then I've done a lot more research. And a year after that first emergency surgery, I learned about excision surgery, which is quote unquote the gold standard for endometriosis treatment at this time. There's no cure, where they go in and they essentially, I'm sorry, I'm probably saying this wrong, but laser out sort of and like cut through even healthy tissue to get out a lot of the endometrial tissue that's where it shouldn't be. And we found an excision specialist in Atlanta, and I had my second surgery about 6 months later. And since then have had way less pain. Instead of being a 10 plus off the charts, now on my period, I have about like a 3 or a 4, which is amazing to me because I never thought that would happen. But it's been a very long, painful road.
What you're saying about how the EMT didn't you said you look normal, but you're saying to him, "I am in so much pain. I need to go to the hospital." That every single time I hear a story like that, it never fails to just make me really angry. At it, just believe women when they say that they are in pain, and it's so
Yes, absolutely.
enraging.
Yeah, and I know that, yeah, that's not an uncommon story to hear, and even if it's not as extreme to get to the hospital, even talking to your GP and saying, "This is what's happening." I never had a doctor say, "Oh, maybe you have endo, or maybe there's some other complication we should look into," even though my pain was extreme. That was all my own research. And at that time, I'm so glad there's so much more out there on the great interwebs right now about endometriosis, but at the time there wasn't that much. And I remember just trying to scour through pages and listen to especially chat forums where other women were talking about this. I was like, okay, so I'm not crazy. I'm not alone. This is an actual thing, because I didn't get that experience from any doctor that I saw. And sometimes people ask like, "Oh, was it a male gynecologist?" I've had tons of gynecologists. They've all been women, and none of them took my pain seriously.
That's I mean, it's not, you would say it's unbelievable, but it's not. I like it. I've heard this so often. Kath, can you talk about your story now?
Yes, mine is slightly less or significantly less traumatic than Laura. And a lot of that I give credit for Laura basically being the guinea pig between the two of us, because we don't know if it was partly because she did get off birth control and that's kind of what triggered more of the endo pain, because I never got off birth control. So when she and her husband had moved to Scotland, I was still on birth control. And by my late 20s, like Laura, I started developing more pain that wasn't just cramping. I mean, all throughout my teens and 20s, certain periods the cramps would be so bad, or I would feel like I had a bowling ball in my uterus. Like, it's such a weird sensation. And I just assumed, especially with her mom who had painful periods, I was like, wow, this is what every woman goes through when they say they have cramps, so like that, I never, even though it was hard to like stand for long periods of time with that sensation, I was like, this is just being a woman. And then by my late 20s, it was actually when I would have my period, on my period, like Laura, I was lucky, didn't have pain off my period, but on my period, when I'd have a bowel movement, the pain like in my pelvic region and I guess around my colon was so extreme that I thought I would pass out. And what's funny, it's like, when you see movies and stuff, people get in so much pain and then they pass out from the pain. Like, I was like, why couldn't that happen? I would just not pass out. I would just have this extreme pain, like where I would see stars. And so and this was all while Laura was going through everything, which was horrendous. And it was horrible too, not being close to her and not understanding the NHS system too. I was so confused by that. They didn't let her have visitors at night. Like also like in the US, which by the way has a very broken medical system too. I think the NHS is great compared to us, but in the States, because everything's charged to you and they try to get you out of the hospital as soon as possible. They do like a million scans that first night. They would have realized what she had sooner if she had been in the States. But that being said, she would have still been dismissed. So that was very like hearing from a distance, hearing her whole experience was kind of mind boggling to me. And I remember being like, well, I just got to keep my periods not super painful. I don't know what I was thinking. I mean, obviously I couldn't do that. I would take ibuprofen when the pain got really bad. I did start taking 1 or 2 days off of work. And that's when I was like, okay, this is affecting my lifestyle. Like I had to accept it. And then it was when the pain was getting so bad by my late 20s. And by then, I think it was right before Laura had discovered that the Center for Endometriosis Care, which is in Atlanta, with a great surgeon, that's when I was like, okay, you know what? I think I'm going to have to do this too. So it was a whole year after Laura had her excision surgery that I got it done too. And I have stage 2 endometriosis. So a significant amount of endometrial growth in my body, but obviously nothing to the extent that stage 4 would have. They did remove my appendix, funnily enough, because they did see endometrioma cells on my appendix. So I still remember it was like they had given me that like horse tranquilizer right before my surgery. And then they come with this clipboard and they're like, oh, just sign here. It basically says we'll take your appendix if it looks, kind of weird. And I was like, oh, like I'm high on drugs. I was like, okay. And but the other thing that you like for the surgery prep, especially because I had told him I had so much pain around my colon, was there was a potential for a colon resectioning, which like by the time I was getting my surgery, I had so much pain. I was like, do it. I don't know, not really thinking of the ramifications. And surprisingly enough, I think they found some endometrial cells around my colon, but not to the extent that they had to do any type of resectioning. So I was very lucky in that sense. And like Laura, since that surgery, I have not had that pain when I go to the bathroom. The pain is definitely, instead of being like a 10, it is now during my period, it is like a 3 or 4, nothing to the extent where I feel like I have to take off work or just lie down, or I don't even need to use heating pads, which is kind of amazing because that's like, I feel like I always had to use those beforehand. So definitely Laura kind of paved the way for me. We both grew up knowing somewhat what endometriosis was. We had heard it because our mom had kind of self-diagnosed, but to us, that just meant like literally you just had painful periods. And so it wasn't until Laura did all her research and she was telling me about it that, I mean, for me, I think maybe it was because of ballet, maybe it was just growing up as a woman in the 90s, as a teenager. Like, to me, it was just like, deal with it, press it down, kind of what Laura said, not being in touch with my body in the sense, like, I always use tampons, so I wouldn't even have to like feel myself bleeding, like all that stuff. And then, yeah, so similar to Laura saying, like, pushing the pain down, trying to ignore it, or just like, quote unquote, dealing with it. To me, that was like from that all the way to like even using tampons all the time instead of pads, so I didn't feel myself bleeding and stuff. And it wasn't until my pain got so bad, and I think I was just so inflamed every time I was on my period, I couldn't really use tampons, or if I did, I could only use the light tampons. And before we went on birth control, I think we went on, now I can't even remember. I think it was in our later teens, and it was mostly for acne, and that didn't do anything for acne. But once we started birth control pretty consistently, our periods weren't super heavy. But when our periods first started and we were doing ballet so much, our periods were so heavy. I remember our classes were like an hour and a half to 2 hours, and I would have to go to the bathroom at least once or twice to change out like a super tampon. But by the time it got to my surgery, which I think I was 29, I can't do the math right now, but late 20s, I wasn't even able to use tampons at all. So that alone, I was like, okay, something's more serious here. But yeah, just the whole experience, I mean, it was traumatic. Laura and I, actually, one of the similarities we did have is after our surgery, we both got post-operation infections, which even our surgeon, he was a great guy, he was like, oh, you have less than 1% chance of getting a post-op infection. And I remember Laura had gotten one after hers, and I was like, oh, I bet I'll get one too. And the doctor was like, no, there's no chance of that. Totally did. Where it was like, and once again, it was that experience of being dismissed. I remember the doctor they kind of put me with after the surgery, it's not the surgeon. I would constantly call him because I had this low grade fever that just wouldn't go away. And something felt wrong. I think this was like a week and a half after my surgery. And I would call the hospital and be like, or I would call the doctor and say, this isn't right. Why am I having a fever? I can't really keep food down. And I remember he just kept saying, oh, this is part of like surgery recovery. And he would brush it off and brush it off and brush it off. And then finally I was talking to my mom, I was like in tears, and my mom was like, that's it. We're just going to the emergency room. And sure enough, there was an abscess. They had to drain an abscess. And I was in the hospital for another 3 days, which in the US, being in a hospital for 3 days is a long time. Like Laura's in the hospital for 2 weeks with the NHS, and that's a long time. But like 3 days in the US, they try to get you out of the hospital as soon as possible. And it was just recovering from that. And I remember, and the antibiotics that I had to take from that probably made me feel much worse than any surgery ever did. And I couldn't eat, but you had to eat to take the antibiotics and stuff. So Laura and I both had that experience too, which was awesome. So our recovery took a lot longer, I think, than most women. But just, that's another example of being kind of ignored, like after you've been through this very intense surgery, and like knowing your body, knowing like this doesn't feel like just a recovery, something's going on. Like my head felt like it was on fire 24/7, I think, from the fever, and just being dismissed after having gone through all of that, and it just blows my mind. And then even today, like Laura was talking, I've had male and female gynecologists. Before my surgery, I would tell them I had endometriosis, and they would always say the same thing. Like Laura said, just take birth control, take pain meds. And then even after I had my surgery, I was like, I have proof, I have stage 2, and I would tell different gynecologists. I specifically remember one, he was just like, oh yeah, that's rough. Like that was literally the response. It wasn't like, okay, well, like, we understand. So you stay on birth control to kind of manage that and, talk through, there's no discussion. I even had, I have some scar tissue. I think it's up towards like the top of my vaginal wall. So it makes penetration with sex very painful, like full penetration. And that I didn't start feeling until like 6 months after my surgery. And I remember going to the gynecologist and just like crying because I was like, I don't know what to do about this. And like for some reason, it wasn't my normal gynecologist. It was another woman in the practice who was like, I think a robot. And she basically was like, well, you're just going to have to get surgery again for that scar tissue. And I was like, but cutting away scar tissue causes more scar tissue. And she was like, yeah. And that was it. She was just like, you need to talk to your surgeon. And this is after, and in the US, like our surgeon wasn't covered by any insurance. He was outside that. So you're paying so much money. I mean, a lot of women can't get the surgery in the first place in the US because they can't afford it. Their insurance obviously is not going to cover it, or they cover a specific surgeon who maybe doesn't do full excision surgery. They just do ablation, and that's not getting to the root of the cause. So, I mean, there's all these things where you're dealing with this medical world too that does not want to support you at all. But then, like when you're going to a gynecologist who's supposed to be, knowledgeable and be focused on female bodies, it's more like indifference than anything, which just blows my mind.
I mean, I'm nodding along as you're talking, and everything you're saying, I keep thinking it's just trauma and then more trauma. And I want to know everything you're going through now. And I want to talk about the company you founded to help women have better periods. But before we talk about that, I just want to talk about how you have gotten past, or if you've gotten past the trauma of the surgeries and dealing with the various doctors and medical professionals who kind of dismissed your pain or tried to downgrade your pain.
Yeah, I would say that I'm still working through the trauma in a lot of ways. I think it's almost been one of the unexpected advantages to starting a company sort of about period pain is I've had to think about my experience more, which has been hard, but also a really positive thing because otherwise I would have reverted back to my usual, just push it down, don't think about it. And I still I think on a day-to-day basis, like now Kath and I talk about it so much, and we have a whole community of other women who have endometriosis pain in Atlanta, but just also online, and just talking to women about their period pain in general. It's so life affirming and empowering in some ways because you don't feel alone. You realize everybody is different. You experience pain differently. Even if I talk with another woman who has stage 4 endometriosis, our experiences are completely different. So there's so much good that's come out of this too. But Kath and I still talk about how before we go to a gynecologist, even for just a normal routine exam, we know we're going to cry in the office. I don't generally, especially you, Kath, I don't think you're big criers. But I just know I feel so vulnerable in that situation. And even if I talk through with my gynecologist, and I usually bring my surgical photos from the inside of my body, and I'm like, this is what I had. I've had the experience like Kath where it's still sort of blown off. And so you just always feel this sort of vulnerable existence when you're in the doctor's office, and that you have to fight. Okay, I need to get my fighting face on because I need to make sure they believe me. I need to advocate for myself. But at the same time, I'm not completely over the trauma that's happened to me before. So I know I'm going to feel really sort of teary-eyed, and then the doctor's not going to take me seriously and all this stuff. That's usually still what's playing through in my head. So yeah, I would say I'm still working through the trauma, still working through some of that pain, but there's been a lot of positive having to go through.
And I think the other thing too is that it seems so like the dark ages, but any gynecologist you go to, their focus is on fertility. And if they most gynecologists have very little experience or got very little education on endometriosis. My guess would be the same with adenomyosis and PCOS, all the other things, PMDD. And to them, it's, at least the ones that I've met, it's just, to them means potentially could affect your fertility. And so even when I try to have these conversations with the gynecologist, they always turn it around to well, I think you could get pregnant, or especially now since we're geriatric moms, if we ever got pregnant, right? Because we're 37 in 2 weeks. I'm going to hold on to that 36 number. We're 36. And so like when I go to the gynecologist, every discussion, it's always like, do you want to freeze your eggs? Which in the States takes, I think it's like at least $20,000 start out. Like, and they talk about it so casually, like everybody has that amount of money, but also that's always how they focus on your body, is basically as a baby making machine. And I feel like even the surgeon too, who we loved, it's still like he's very used to having the conversation around fertility. Like, how does your endometriosis, how will that affect your fertility and that kind of thing? And both, obviously, neither one of us have kids. Neither one of us have decided whether or not we want kids, even though, it's getting a little late for us. But to me, it was always like, no, I want to focus on fixing my body first before I could even think of having, a parasite. You know what I'm saying? Like, I just was like, why am I going to focus on kids now when like I'm in so much pain? But it's just funny, the whole dialogue around it, even at doctors' offices, even if they like, kind of ignore your pain, it is always about fertility and how you're basically worthy as a woman because of your level of fertility. That's how I see it. And like Laura, I always have to prep myself before I actually have my annual is on Monday. And I know like I'm going to get there early. I'm going to do breathing exercises. I'm going to be ready for the doctor to dismiss me or, want to talk about freezing my eggs again, even though I told her last time I saw her, I was like, you need to write down in my file, do not talk to me about freezing my eggs. And even when I said that, even when I met with her last year, she was like, really? Are you sure? And I was like, come on, lady, like you're educated. Listen to me. So like it still is like, it's something we deal with. And I think Laura said starting Semaine has kind of forced us to have those difficult conversations and revisit it. But I think that's very healthy and something that we need to do. And it's been so empowering hearing other women's stories, and knowing that we're not alone, and the fact that we could create this thing with Laura's husband that actually helps women through their pain.
What you're saying about having to prepare to go and see your doctor, to see your gynecologist, I think it's really important, because in an ideal world, we wouldn't have to do that. We could go and our doctors would have the time to spend with us and have the time to ask questions and really figure out what's going on in the moment. But certainly in the UK, there's 10 minutes and you have to make the most of those 10 minutes. But I love what you're saying about, you do your breathing exercise, you've got your notes. Laura, you were saying you take the photos of your prior surgery. You tell them to refer back to the notes you asked them to make on your file before. I think all of those are really important for women to remember. They have to go in prepared and be prepared to advocate for themselves. And if they don't feel comfortable doing that, bring someone with them who can do that for them. I want to go on to talk about your company. So is it Semaine? Because I'm thinking French, Semaine means week, or how do you pronounce it?
You are completely right, and you are saying it correctly. As Americans, we say Semaine. We butcher everything. So yes, it is the French word for the week. But we butcher it in American French and say Semaine. So yes, that is the name, and it came from the fact that the supplement that we created, which is a plant-based anti-inflammatory, is just for the week of your period or whenever you have the most pain on your cycle. Generally, even women who have sort of pain throughout their cycle, that might be the worst pain is during ovulation, maybe, or maybe it's right before your period. But for me personally, I've always been really bad about taking supplements continually. And so when Matt, my husband, and I, and Kath, when we were creating this, I was like, I am not going to take something every single day. I won't remember. And I don't like the idea of having to take a pill every single day, even if it is all natural and plant-based. And so because we were focusing on the inflammation aspect of period pain rather than balancing hormones, making sure you have more estrogen or less estrogen, we could really focus lowering that inflammation when you need it the most on your period. So in general, this is something that I had no idea about before we started Semaine. My husband did. He's a research scientist. He has a PhD in bioengineering. That on your cycle, over the course of, 28 days roughly. Of course, everybody's different, but that your immune system sort of works cyclically as well. So when you're moving into your ovulation period, your immune system pulls back a little bit just in case you have foreign DNA that enters your body, and you're impregnated. So your immune system's like, okay, we don't want to attack that. Let's pull back. And then if you're not getting pregnant, your immune system kind of comes roaring back in the next 2 weeks and reaches its peak as you start to bleed. And a lot of the times with that immune system, that causes a lot of inflammation. Your immune response and inflammation is connected. And so those of us with painful periods, not just with endometriosis, but with just painful periods in general, you're having sort of a stronger immune response and more inflammation. So the thinking behind creating an anti-inflammatory is we're lowering that inflammation level. So it's all about, like helping your body do its thing, have its period, but with sort of supported help of lowering the inflammation markers that are happening and causing a lot of pain. And that has been tremendously helpful for me because I know I was always sort of nervous about taking different things that regulated my hormones because there's not a lot of research behind endometriosis, behind PCOS, behind any of these period-related conditions. I think there's not a lot of understanding of exactly how our hormones are sort of out of whack, and that can vary from person to person. So I really wanted something that could address the pain without having to be like, I don't know, is my estrogen too high? A lot of people do think endometriosis is estrogenic, so there is a link there, but they're still not sure. I mean, again, because this is a quote unquote woman's disease, the research is starting now. There's a lot more research than there used to be, but there isn't a lot of, there hasn't been in the past. And just generally in medical history, there hasn't been a lot of research on women. I think a lot of people have probably heard that study about how like women experience heart attacks different than men, but the symptoms we're taught to look out for are the symptoms that men usually have. And I remember reading, this was a study done 10 or 15 years ago on cervical cancer, and they tested the drug just on men who don't have cervixes, so it's like, just like, it blows your mind when you learn about this stuff where you're like, wait, you have to be doing these studies on women. And a big reason they don't do the studies on women and then prior to human subjects, why they don't do it on like female rats, is because the hormones and having menstrual blood is very complicated and it complicates the results. And you're like, yes, but the people taking it, 50% plus, are going to be people who have menstruated at some point and have these complex hormones. Even when I was in the hospital, actually in Edinburgh, it was a female doctor who was super sweet, but I remember at one point she said, it'd be so much easier for us to figure out what was going on with you if you were a man, because all your bits are on the outside. And I was like, wait, what? I was like, what? I remember just thinking, oh my God, like this is the extent of medical knowledge, sort of like generally in the community. I was like, we don't have a chance in hell. Like, how is this? This is like the response. And starting Semaine, we've learned that up to 80% of women have painful periods in their lifetime. So this isn't abnormal. It's like everybody has pain, and you experience at different levels. Definitely our stories are a little more acute, and having endometriosis is something that not all women have, though more than 10% of women do have endometriosis. So none of these things are super, unusual. And the fact that there aren't hardly any pharmaceutical drugs specifically for women's pain, or even a lot of like natural things that we can do on the market right now, is really telling to me. The fact that women's pain isn't taken seriously. If PMS and endometriosis and all of those conditions were something that men experienced, we'd have gobs of research. We'd have so many, if there are 5,000 pills for erectile dysfunction, but nothing for, period pain specifically, except for maybe Midol or Pamprin, which hasn't changed in the last 25 years, something's wrong. Something's broken with innovation in healthcare for women, for sure.
I always think about that line in the show Veep. Did you ever watch it? I don't know if it would come if it was in the UK at all, because it is very specific to the US. But it's the main character at one point. She was like, if men got pregnant, you could get an abortion in an ATM by now. And that's what I always think about. It's so true. Stuff was focused on men, but that I think is so cool about Semaine is that, so Lauren and Matt, after Scotland, they moved to Seattle, and that's when Laura was, especially even now when we get cramps and stuff, I think we're a little triggered by experiences before we had our surgery. So even though we know the pain's not going to get as bad, it's still very triggering. And so Laura's husband, he's a scientist, he has a PhD, and was working for the University of Washington at the time. And he started doing research and reading up on white papers and peer-reviewed papers on anything that could possibly help. So he started getting all these like extracts like in powder form and adding them to her smoothies. And it was, I always joke that like the few times I would like go and visit them in Seattle, I'd like come to their kitchen. They had all these like jars of random powders around. Like, what is going on? But so he played around with the formula, I would say like about 2 years. Right. So, and Laura was telling me how much of a difference it was making. And I was like, send it to me. Cause I've been in Atlanta this whole time, and they literally sent me, it was a jar. I think he sent me like a little scoop, and with like Lauren's handwritten instructions, like how many scoops I should put in a smoothie each day. And I remember the first period I had using it, like my pain was reduced so much. And it wasn't until we started talking about it, we were like, well, if this works for us, then maybe it'll work for other women. And that's how it got started, like literally from them having a kitchen full of jars with powders in them.
Wow. And so then you found that this worked for you. And then talk about the process of getting it onto the market.
Yeah, that's been a long journey because Matt and I started testing those different plant extract powders. So it was like powders of green tea and curcumin. And I feel like those people have maybe heard of as far as being good anti-inflammatories or antioxidants. But we were testing other things like something called resveratrol, something called boswellia, which is from frankincense. Matt had been doing research at the University of Washington about chronic inflammation and aging. So that's how it was sort of in his mind already about like, maybe we don't address hormones, but we address the inflammation that's happening every month when you're on your period. And so after about 2 years of trying this, and Kath and I being the guinea pigs, we opened it up to a larger test group of about 10 women who had period pain. So a couple of them did have endometriosis, but most of them just had general period pain. So not just pelvic pain and cramps, but maybe they got migraines or leg pain. There's lots of different types of pain that are associated with getting your period. And we had really good results from that test. And so after getting those results, we were like, okay, let's start this as a business and let's see if we can launch this as a product. And so originally it was, we were just putting the powders and pills ourselves, but we found a manufacturer. And Matt and I quit our jobs in Seattle and moved to Atlanta, where we're now living with Kath, which is so fun. And we focused on this full time, and we started an Indiegogo campaign in the fall to just sort of raise awareness, and also a way to raise a little bit of money, but mainly to get sort of the name out there and make sure people are hearing that we're doing this thing for period pain. And then in February of this year, we launched full time. And so right now we sell Semaine directly from our website at semainehealth.com, but we're hoping to branch into retail so it's more readily available to everyone. We do ship internationally, but most of our subscribers right now are in the States just because international shipping is really expensive. But we're hoping, eventually to expand, and we could have distribution centers in the UK and Australia specifically, because we get a lot of great feedback from those two countries. But that's how it started. It was literally trying to find something to fix my pain. We weren't thinking of it as a business at all. But then when Catherine was like, it's working for me, and the women we had in our study was like, yes, you need to make more of this. We were like, okay, we want to help other women. It was such a relief to have less painful periods. The fact that we are now helping other people have less painful periods, like I couldn't ask for a better purpose in life, really, because I just never thought that was possible. I don't know if it was because of years of being told that, oh, this is the only thing you can do. You can go on birth control, you can take ibuprofen, that I just thought that was kind of it. It didn't even strike me that why aren't there more products out there for women, Mm-hmm. And I think it's such a great time now because people are talking about periods more openly. You have this wonderful podcast where people are talking about their first periods, and hearing the differences in those stories are amazing. I think it's so great to normalize those conversations. And I think that will change the way innovation happens around women's healthcare. Just the fact that, people are making organic pads or reusable menstrual cups, and like all of like the Honey Pot Co. I don't know if that's big in the UK yet, but it's here in Target, that, having feminine care wipes, like that's, something that's in like the vernacular that we growing up, we never talked about that sort of thing, and that wasn't on the shelf at Target. And now you see that, and women are interested in trying more natural solutions or just any solutions to try to make their periods better or more manageable, and not this hush hush taboo thing that you can't talk about.
I think it's incredible what you both have done, and I love that you took an issue that you had and you then created something that would not only help you but would help loads of people with the same problem. So amazing. I can't wait to see it here in the UK. But to round off our conversation, you both have said so many amazing things. What would you want someone listening to the podcast to take away from what you individually have said?
That's such a great question, Lenise. I would say, as hard as it is, always trust yourself and advocate for yourself. You do know your body better than anybody else, better than any doctor, better than anybody in your family. Being in tune with your body and knowing something doesn't feel right, push your doctor, push your healthcare provider to give you answers. If I had known that when I was younger, I just always assumed, oh, this person went to medical school and is a doctor. They know way more than me. If something was wrong, they would tell me. And I think, doctors are amazing and they're great. And I'm so glad we have the healthcare available that we can go to them. But that doesn't mean that they know you better than you know yourself. Listen to your body if something feels wrong, and also listen to yourself, and not just assume that because one treatment works for one person, that's what you need to do. I think a lot of the time in the health and wellness space, we're like, oh, I found this diet that cured me of this thing. My endo is so much better because I stopped eating gluten. That is amazing and that works for a lot of people, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for you and you have to do that same thing. If birth control works for you, if you need to be able to take that in order to get through day-to-day life, do that. Don't ever feel ashamed because people are pushing a certain solution on you. I think that's so important.
Yep. Same exact thing. Reiterate, advocate for yourself. I think that's the big thing. If I could go back in time and talk to my 12-year-old ashamed self with my period, just giving myself grace, but also telling myself trust yourself and be comfortable with your voice, especially when you're with doctors. And then the other thing, what Laura said, exactly, we're identical twins and we've had very different experiences. Compared to Laura, I eat garbage, once in a while I eat fast food. I love to drink a Coke. Okay, so please don't judge. But Laura is much healthier than me, and part of that is driven by the pain that she had and kind of the PTSD left over from her experiences. But for me, diet does help, absolutely, without a doubt. But if I had just started looking into not just endometriosis, but period pain, and seeing all these like wellness warriors who can, eat just kale for a day and, that works for them, that I would feel kind of alienated from that. So I think reiterating what Laura said, like, you figure out what works for you and then give yourself grace. You're not going to be this perfect pinnacle of health, and you're going to have bad days and good days, and just celebrate the things that do work. But yeah, not some women don't want to use tampons or don't want to use hormonal birth control, and that is great. But some women do, and that's also great. So giving yourself grace and figuring out, like Laura said, become an expert of your own body and what works for you.
Thank you so much. I honestly feel like I could talk to you guys for another hour. It was just so brilliant.
Thank you so much, Lenise. This was so
fun. You mentioned the website URL before. Can you just mention it again so listeners know where to find out about Semaine?
Yes, thank you. It's semainehealth.com. So Semaine is spelled Semaine, health.com. And we're also very active on Instagram. And that's just at Semaine Health. So thank you so much, Lenice. Yes, that's where you can find us. We're there all the time. We also have a chat on our website, and that's us answering questions. We love when people pepper us with questions about Semaine. So please feel free to do that.
Thank you so much. For more inspiring conversations, head over to periodstorypod.com, where we have so many more for you to peruse. If you want help with your menstrual or hormone health, email me on hello@eatlovemove.com to set up a free 30-minute hormone health review. If you like today's show, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Tag us, come say hi, and send in your requests for who you'd like to see on the show on Instagram and Twitter on @periodstorypod, or email us at hello@periodstorypod.com. I'm Lenice Brothers, and you've been listening to Period Story. Thank you so much for listening.